All right, let's get started with chapter 14 about the Civil War. Little image to start us off. And there's going to be 6 sections. We'll take each one at a time, and we'll start with this one, the First Modern War. And that's the focus question. The American Civil War has been called the First Modern War. This was the first time mass armies fought with weapons forged by the Industrial Revolution, and the scale of casualties was unprecedented in American history. The war became a conflict between societies as the distinction between military and civilian targets diminished. Wars like this depend on the effectiveness of political leaders, the capacity to mobilize economic resources, and a society's determination to continue the war despite failures. The Union seemed favor over the Confederacy. The North, including loyal border states, had a population of 22 million, while the South had only 9 million, 3.5 million of whom were enslaved. The Union had far more manufacturing, railroad track, and financial resources. Yet, to end the rebellion, the Union had to invade and conquer a huge area and defeat spirited Confederate soldiers defending homes and families. Even if the South lost most battles, it could win by exhausting the enemy. The outbreak of war stimulated powerful feelings of patriotism, and recruits hastened to enlist, thinking the war would be short and glorious. Both sides later resorted to a draft, the Confederacy in 1862, the Union the next year. By 1865, more than 2 million men had served in the Union Army and 900,000 in the Confederate. Each army was a cross-section of its society. The Northern Army was composed of mostly farm boys, shopkeepers, artisans, and urban workers, and the Southern Army consisted mostly of non-slaveholding small farmers and slaveholding officers. Few soldiers had any military experience, their notions of war were highly romanticized, and most were unprepared for military regimentation. The beginning of the war was mostly the chores of military encampment and mobilization, only occasionally interrupted by short bursts of intense fighting. Soldiers and officers did not anticipate how technological advances changed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which the railroad moved troops and supplies. The war saw the famous battle between the Union vessel Monitor and the Confederate Merrimack in 1862, which showed the advantage of ironclads over wooden ships and transformed naval warfare. The telegraph, observation balloons, and even hand grenades and submarines were used for the first time. Most important was the revolution in arms manufacturing, which replaced the musket, accurate only at a short range, with the rifle, deadly at 600 or more yards because of its grooved barrel. This changed the nature of combat, making heavy fortifications and trenches far more important and giving defensive forces, usually Confederates, a significant advantage. This development produced the awful casualties of the war's battles. Medical care was primitive, and for the first time, large numbers of Americans were captured and held as prisoners of war in camps, leading to high death rates. At least 750,000 died in the war, the equivalent of more than 7 million in today's population, and more than the entire number of Americans killed in all other wars in U.S. history, from the Revolution to the Iraq War. War was becoming more destructive worldwide, and though the scale of the Civil War was unique in American history, the 19th century saw frequent destruction of its magnitude, such as in the Taiping Rebellion, which had 23 million deaths, and the War of the Triple Alliance in South America, which led to half of Paraguay's pre-war population of about 500,000 dead. The Civil War was also modern in the use of propaganda by both sides to mobilize public opinion. In the North, patriotic organizations and the War Department reaffirmed Northern values, portrayed the Democratic Party as treasonous, and accused the South of crimes against Union soldiers and loyal civilians. The South engaged in similar campaigns. Modern media, with newspapers, telegraphs, and especially photographs, for the first time captured the often shocking reality of war and communicated it to the public. Both sides were unprepared for war. There was no national banking system, no tax system to raise revenue for the war, and few accurate maps of the South. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln enacted a blockade of the South intended to destroy its commerce, but the Navy at first had too few ships to enforce it. The problems of purchasing and distributing food, weapons, and other supplies for the armies were huge. While the Union Army eventually became the best fed and best supplied force in history, Southern soldiers lacked food, uniforms, and shoes. Lacking sufficient industrial capacity, the Confederate government imported many items for the military from abroad and established its own arsenals. Each side tried to exploit its advantages, the South by adopting a defensive strategy to wear down the North, led by the brilliant Robert E. Lee, and the North by using its superiority in manpower and technology. But the Northern Army was at first small, its officers and leadership were poor, and it was focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, which was a difficult task. Lincoln soon realized that capturing and occupying territory would not win the war. Defeating the South's armies would. Lincoln's eventual embrace of emancipation acknowledged that slavery was the basis of the Confederacy and that to win the conflict, the Union had to make this institution, the economic and social foundation of the South, a military target. Most of the war in the East occurred in a narrow corridor between Washington and Richmond as a series of Union generals led the North's Army of the Potomac toward the Confederate capital, only to be repeatedly repulsed by the main Confederate Army. The First Battle of Bull Run ended in the defeat and chaotic retreat of Union forces. This battle ended the widespread belief that the war would end quickly. George B. McClellan soon took command of the Union's main army, but after thoroughly training this army's tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers, he proved reluctant to commit them to battle. McClellan was a Democrat, and he hoped that compromise might end the conflict without many casualties or weakening slavery. Months of military inactivity followed. In the spring of 1862, George B. McClellan, pressured by public opinion, President Lincoln, and Congress, led the Army of the Potomac, more than 100,000 men, into Virginia. Approaching the Confederate capital on the peninsula southwest of Richmond, McClellan's advance was ably deflected by Lee in a series of battles, forcing McClellan back to Washington, D.C. After Lee won the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, he invaded the North, hoping to bring border slave states into the Confederacy, gain French and British recognition of Southern independence, influence the North's elections in the fall, and perhaps capture Washington. At the Battle of Antietam, McClellan and his army repelled Lee's invasion. In one day at Antietam, nearly 4,000 men were killed and 18,000 wounded. More Americans died in this battle on September 17, 1862, than on any other day in American history, including Pearl Harbor and D-Day in World War II and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The Northern triumph was short-lived. General Ambrose Burnside, who replaced McClellan, was repulsed by Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December of 1862 with heavy losses. The North had better luck in the West. There, Ulysses S. Grant, a West Point graduate whose Army career had been ruined by his excessive drinking, captured several important forts in Tennessee in early 1862. In April 1862, naval forces under Admiral David G. Farragut steamed into New Orleans and captured that city for the Union, which now controlled the South's largest city and its lucrative nearby sugar plantations. After Grant repelled a surprise Confederate attack at Shiloh, Tennessee, Union success in the West stalled. So that's our first question. We'll come back for the second section next.